Hi, everybody. So first, I just want to start by pointing out that this paper is pretty weird, and it's actually not a health study, and it's not an observational health outcomes research study, which makes it pretty bizarre. But um, but it is relevant to the work, and I think you might get a kick out of it. So what we did with this paper, it's actually pretty fast, is actually first I want to talk about the paper briefly, and it's available so you can read it. But then I want to talk about why we did this, and the why we did it is the interesting part. So what the paper is about is we document the complexity of, and then we actually go out and build an OMOP CDM out of something called T-MSIS Analytic Extract Files, TAF for short. And what that is, quickly in 8 minutes, it's a 100% sample of Medicaid records from every state health department in the United States. And what we've done is we've taken this, we've tried to turn it into an OMOP CDM, and we've done this for several reasons, which we'll get to in a minute. And I apologize for all the acronyms, but it's healthcare service research slang, and I'll try to define them as they come up. So now we don't just have TAF records at the NLM. We actually have a massive collection of CMS records. And those records span TAF, which is the recent vintage of Medicaid records. There's also MAX records, which is the legacy vintage of Medicaid records. We also have something we call RIF-PDE, which is a research identifiable file of prescription drug events. And that's all of Medicare, parts A, B, and C in RIF. And then what we call PD is Part D Medicaid or Part D Medicare records. We have every record since 1999, and it's massive. It's maybe the largest observational clinical database in the world, although how you think about size gets really tricky when you're working at this scale. It's got about 600,000 variables in it. It's about 50 compressed terabytes. So who knows how big that actually is? And it's about 320 billion rows or records or observations or whatever language you want to use for that. So it's massive. Um, so our ETL for the TAF subset, and that's really just the last 4 or 5 years of Medicaid, has got about 119 million distinct individuals in it. And our whole set, max TAF with PDE, has got about 300 million people described in it. And it's about 11 to 12 years of follow-up on average, but though it also ranges pretty extremely depending on which patient you're talking about. So in the paper, we review the ETL mapping method, as well as the utilization of DX, PX, and RX codes, as well as using Databricks, which in and of itself is sort of a novel practice for CMS. So we built this, and that's really cool. And you can think about using this as a candidate CDM as you think about doing a network study. But what's really important is why we built it. So I work on a project at NLM where we investigate the interoperability, impact, and value add of what we call complex clinical observational data sets. And then we make non-trivial real-world data use cases out of these data sets. We do studies with them. And when I say complex, I mean they're really hard to work with. They're hard to work with for all kinds of reasons. For example, with the CMS data, it's an absurd amount of information, but a lot of people, there are a lot of counterfactuals. There's a lot of physical issues working with the data that become a barrier to using it. And the NLM is very interested in lowering the barrier to using these massive data sets. And complexity doesn't necessarily mean huge. You could have a data set with 5,000 patients that's absurdly difficult to use when we would try to make it easier. So the products that we're currently working with is we're building OMOP CDM ETL code, and we're doing this for our internal use. For example, with the CMS collection, we made ETLs for TAF, for current vintage Medicaid, that's funded by ASPE, the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation. Both RIF, PDE, and MAX are being funded by the Office of AIDS Research at NIH for specifically for HIV research. But because we're doing every patient, there are HB negatives in RIF, PD, and MAX, so you could reuse the data for non-HIV research if you wanted to. And we made good progress, actually. So we've got ETL in production for CDM for TAF. We also have ETL in production for RIF PDE. And then MAX should be done at some point in the next 6 weeks. And we just finished a Medicare RIF PDE transformation like 2 weeks ago. So this is happening now. And what does internal use mean? This is really important, especially with the Odyssey group. So, we're not supporting or developing code for external partners at this time, but we will share the code to support your development and your use of it. That's fine. But we don't envision making a like a standalone OMOP-ish product. And we're not interested in doing that because, fun fact, CMS itself is interested in building an OMOP CDM out of its own data, which it would vend to feds and non-feds potentially. And we would just use their product when it becomes available, but their product most likely won't be available for several years. And we have this data now, and we didn't want to wait. So in that direction, I also wanted to point out sort of why we're making it. I think of you guys as making OMOP CDMs to do network studies, whereas our true interest in using OMOP is a problem that I described at the bottom of the slide where it's the normalization. So in Medicare with PDE, there are maybe 200 locations where a diagnostic code and a date can be attributed to a distinct individual. And because that data model is month, year, and we've got 22 years of data to date, and we've got 12 months in a year, that's actually 58,800 locations you have to search to put a diagnostic code and a date next to a patient, which is crazy. So that's 58,800 table variable pairs just to look for diagnosis. But in the OMOP model, you actually only have to look in one table variable pair to find a diagnostic code and a date assigned to a patient. It's way easier to use. It's faster to use. It's really our goal in using it. But there is, potential second life for this in supporting network studies. So, thanks for the background. Can we see it? This is the other challenge is it's inside a federal data center, and federal data centers have extreme access restrictions that aren't going to go away anytime soon. There are also nationality limits on who can use CMS data and where in the world, which is very anti-Odyssey and OMOP. So there are a lot of rules that aren't going to change anytime soon, and I don't know how to get around that. On the other hand, we've got folks at the NLM who have access to the product, and that's a good starting point. You don't necessarily need a security clearance. We would probably run it for you, is how we would do it. And then last slide, this was fast. So I think our next step is really to do a standalone replication study of a network study that you guys have already done to really figure out how much of the OMOP code base is FTC ready. You can't use Java, you can't use databases, you can't use self-executed programs, you're limited to the size of the files you can upload. And even getting Athena into the FTC was really hard because Athena, big files, and you're not supposed to upload files larger than 50 megs, so it really took a lot of effort to get Athena into the thing. But yeah, so this exists and it's happening and it's kind of available in the next 6 weeks. And our next step, I think, is to figure out how we would do a CMS/non-CMS network study. We've maybe got, oh gosh, I don't know, 4 or 5 million providers, maybe a couple thousand care sites. You could do a network study within the CMS data if you wanted to. But yeah, that's sort of what we're thinking about in broad strokes. And this is how far we've gotten. And there's a paper you can read about the TAF work. I kind of hope we don't end up doing, salami publishing and doing a paper about RIF-PD and a paper about Max as well, with the understanding that we've actually done all 4 or in the process of doing all 4 transformations. And yeah, that's our paper, and that's what I wanted to share with you guys about it. So thanks so much.